Hi, I'm Carter Wilson, and welcome to Motivations for Writers. So, I've been thinking a lot lately about how people become who they become, and it occurred to me I've never shared in full how I became who I became. And I'm not talking about professionally, I mean personally. Because when people ask me how I became a writer, I usually tell them the story about the Ramada Hotel. It's a true story, but it's also incomplete. So back in 2003, I was working as a consultant in the hospitality industry, and I had to take one of those brutal continuing education classes in order to keep my real estate license active. And this meant 8 hours in a Ramada ballroom outside of Denver. And if you've ever had to sit in one of these classes, you know this room. Dingy, fluorescent lights, bad coffee, uncomfortable seating, a speaker at the front just reading from a binder. And this was before smartphones, so there was no place for my attention to hide. It was the kind of situation where either I was going to listen or my mind was going to wander. And after about 6 of the 8 hours, my mind absolutely started wandering. And I had this idea to pass the time. I had this strange idea that maybe I would just make up a riddle. I would make up a riddle, pose it to myself, and spend the last 2 hours of the class trying to figure out my own riddle. It seems fairly provincial looking back on it now, but this is what happened. And I don't know why this particular riddle popped into my head, this little murder mystery riddle, but the following question is what came to my head. If 3 people are murdered at exactly the same time, in exactly the same way, in different parts of the world, what's the connection? And again, I have no idea why that particular question appeared. I wish I did, but I spent the rest of the class trying to answer it. And simply put, I couldn't. And every time I would come up with what I thought was a potential solution, more questions would arise. And it did its job. It passed the 2 hours. But what surprised me was how much I cared about this particular question. I drove home still thinking about it. I made dinner still thinking about it. I remember sitting down at the computer and just thinking, well, maybe if I knew who these people were. And I started writing. That was it. There wasn't another reason. I wasn't trying to write a novel. And actually, the funny thing is there was absolutely no reason I should have been writing a novel. I didn't want to grow up to be an author. I went to hotel school. I studied real estate finance. My career was in hospitality consulting. I never took a creative writing class. And I'm ashamed to say I don't think I took a single class in college that required me to read a novel. I didn't even become a serious reader until I was in my 20s and living alone in San Francisco. I'd wander through used bookstores and buy the fattest books I could because they had the most words for the money. I got into Stephen King, James Clavell, John Jakes, Frederick Forsyth. I loved getting lost in those books. And it never occurred to me that people like me wrote them. So there I was sitting at my computer trying to figure out why these 3 people had been murdered. And one paragraph became another, and then another, and pretty soon I had pages. Eventually I had chapters, although I wasn't entirely sure how those even worked. I kept coming home after work because I wanted to see what happened next, if I was getting closer to solving my riddle. And to this day, writing that book was still one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. I've tried over the years to explain it, and I don't think I've ever quite gotten it right. It wasn't discipline. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't some lifelong dream finally coming true. I guess it felt more like following a trail that only I could see. Every answer created another question, and every question made me more curious. And in 3 months, I had a 400-page manuscript. And I knew two things about this experience. One, I knew I had written a very subpar novel. But two, I knew this was an experience I had to pay attention to. This was something life-changing. I felt that in my bones, even if I couldn't quite describe how my life was supposed to change. I can't even really look at that manuscript anymore, that old book. I never reread any of my old stuff. But once in a while, if I do flip through it, I will be assured that most of it will make me cringe or laugh. But every now and then I'll run across a sentence and think, oh, there I am. I could see the writer starting to show up. I just didn't know it then. I just knew something unusual had happened. And the manuscript wasn't the important part. The experience was. I remember sitting there with those 400 pages spread across my desk thinking, I don't know what this is. And then that was followed by the thought of, well, whatever this is, I need to pay attention. And looking back, I think that's the first really good decision I made as a writer. And perhaps one of the most important decisions I've ever made as a human. I paid attention. The funny thing is, once I decided this was worth paying attention to, I still had no idea what I was supposed to do next. So I did what everybody does. I Googled it. I typed in something like, how do you publish a novel? And Google told me I needed an agent, which raised the question, what the hell is an agent? So I Googled that. I love thinking about it because it reminds me how completely outside this world I was. I didn't know the vocabulary. I didn't know the process. I didn't know what a query letter was. I certainly didn't know I'd written a thriller. It was my agent who eventually informed me of that. I was learning an entirely new language. And looking back, I think that was actually an advantage. I wasn't carrying around years of assumptions about how publishing worked. I just kept taking the next step because I didn't know there was another option. After 75 rejections and a year mailing out query letters, and this is, of course, back in the time when we were physically mailing them out, I did land an agent with that subpar novel. She saw something in it that I didn't. And she's still my agent more than 20 years later, which says something about her patience and our relationship. And she sent that first manuscript out to publishers, and they all turned it down. And I wish I could tell you that rejection was devastating, but it really wasn't. It was, of course it was disappointing. I had invested a lot of time in that book, but it somehow didn't crush me. But another thought started nagging at me. If this book doesn't sell, I don't have anything else. My agent doesn't make any money unless one of my books sells. So what's to stop her from deciding I'm not worth the effort? And that thought scared the hell out of me. So I started writing another novel. People sometimes ask me how I handled rejection, and the truth is, I don't think rejection occupied as much space in my head as curiosity did. I wanted to get better. I wanted to figure out why the book hadn't connected. I wanted to solve another puzzle, which is why I wrote that second book. But that second novel was also rejected. You'd think there would have been some dramatic moment where I just questioned everything. And there really wasn't. And I've wondered about that. Why didn't I quit? I mean, I think part of it was I had still had my full-time job. I still had an income. I was still providing. So as long as I could find the time to write, why not continue? But I also think it's because I never believed publishing was the thing pulling me forward. It was writing. And, those are different motivations. One depends on someone saying yes. And the other begins just the moment you sit down in the chair. I mean, if you'd asked me why I kept going, I probably would have shrugged and said, I don't know. I just want to write another one. But I think that answer feels a lot wiser to me now than it did then. And around that time, something else was happening. Very few people knew I was writing, even after I had an agent. Even after I had books making the rounds in New York. I still spent my days in the corporate world. Hospitality consulting paid the bills. We were having kids. Writing happened in the mornings, at night, on airplanes and hotel rooms. They felt like two completely separate lives. And I was strangely protective of the writing life. And I think a big part of it was imposter syndrome. It was embarrassment. I wasn't making any money. I hadn't published anything. So actually calling myself a writer out loud felt premature. So if someone asked what I did for a living, I told them I was a hotel consultant. That was the answer that made sense. That was the answer that was paying my bills. Looking back, that's one of my biggest regrets. I wish I'd answered it differently. And not because other people needed to hear it, but because I needed to hear myself say it. I think it's weird. Just identity has a strange way of lagging behind reality. Like sometimes you've already become the person you're becoming, and you're just the last one to realize it. Something else was changing during those years, and I don't think I noticed it at first. When I started writing, it was something I did. Then little by little, it started changing how I experienced the rest of my life. I was paying more attention, and that's probably the simplest way to describe it. I would notice conversations differently. I'd watch people differently. I would analyze a book or a TV show in a way I never had before. I'd become fascinated by why somebody chose one word instead of another, or I'd wonder what they weren't saying. Or I'd imagine the history they carried into the room with them. I think I was just becoming more curious. And that curiosity didn't just stay on the pages I was writing, it started changing me. And I think that's one of the things we don't talk about enough. People assume writing is a way of expressing yourself. And I suppose it is. But for me, it became a way of discovering myself. Every novel was a different mile marker in my life. Every novel asked something different of me. One book might demand empathy, one might demand honesty. One might demand that I just sit with uncertainty or deal with subject matters that maybe made me uncomfortable. And all the while I thought I was learning how to write, but looking back, I was learning how to pay attention. Life started just feeling bigger, more connected, certainly more interesting. Even difficult experiences began carrying this strange second question. What am I supposed to notice here? I don't think I'd ever lived that way before. I was just on this path that I felt was predestined until I started writing. And writing became less about producing books. It became a kind of lens, and the world just looked different through it. Around this time, my marriage ended. And I don't tell this part of the story very often because this isn't a story about divorce. My ex-wife and I are still good friends. We genuinely care about each other. Life simply moved us in different directions, and I have thought about why. I don't think writing caused the divorce. That would be far too simple, but I think what writing did was slowly introduce me to a version of myself I hadn't known before. And that process can be wonderful, and it can also be disruptive. Because once you begin recognizing yourself for your true being, certain parts of your life inevitably begin to feel different. Sometimes relationships change, sometimes careers change. Sometimes the future you thought you were building no longer fits the person you're becoming. None of that happened overnight, of course. There wasn't a single decision. There wasn't a dramatic turning point. There were hundreds of small moments where I just found myself becoming more comfortable with the person I was discovering. And I think that's what writing gave me more than anything else, was an honest relationship with myself. And I will tell you, once you have that, it is surprisingly difficult to abandon. And that doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easier. If anything, it becomes more honest. There were still rejections, still disappointments, books that didn't sell, plenty of mornings where I wondered if any of this was going anywhere. The difference was I wasn't measuring my life the same way anymore. I think, years earlier, I would have judged success almost entirely by outcomes. Did I get the promotion? Did I hit the goal? Did I accomplish what I set out to accomplish? And I think what writing did was introduce another question altogether. Am I becoming someone I actually recognize? Years went by. I fell in love with the partner who I'm with to this day. Books started to come out. Some did a little better than the ones before them. Some didn't. I kept chasing the same goal I'd had from the beginning. Just get a little bit bigger. I honestly never pictured myself as a best-selling author. I wouldn't allow myself to imagine that. And I don't think that was ever really the dream. I just wanted to keep earning the opportunity to write the next book. And I think looking back, I think that's the goal that probably saved me. Because get a little bigger is something you can actually work toward. You write a better book. You become a better storyteller. You find a publisher that has a little bit more distribution ability. You hope more readers find you. And that's enough. And then something happened that caught me completely off guard. And by this point, I had published 9 novels. 9. I'd been doing this for years. I'd found a wonderful publisher, I had an editor I trusted, and I honestly thought I knew who I was as a writer. Then I turned in a manuscript to my publisher, and it was a book I'd written during COVID. And I really liked it. I still really like it. But my editor didn't. She didn't hate it. And that almost would have been easier. She just simply wasn't excited. I remember her saying something like, I don't think this is the book that's going to take your career where you want it to go. I mean, that's a scary thing to hear when you've been working on something for a year. Especially after 9 books. Especially after you think you've figured things out. And I spent a lot of time asking myself why she wasn't connecting with it, and then I realized something. I had written the entire novel in third-person past tense. And maybe that sounds like a technical detail, but to writers, it's a significant one, because for years I'd been drifting towards first-person present tense, which I think was synonymous with me finding my voice, because every time I wrote that way, the characters just felt more alive to me. I understood them better. I could hear them. I could get inside their heads. And this book was different. I convinced myself the story needed distance. And what the problem was is I wasn't trusting myself enough to get close to that character. So after talking to my editor, I decided to rewrite the entire novel, 400 pages. Same story, different point of view, changing it from third person past tense to first person present, and it took about 4 months. And my editor liked it more, and they published it. The book came out, and it, to this day, is still one of my lowest selling novels. So if you're looking for a story where the rewrite changed everything, this isn't it. What changed wasn't the sales. What changed was me. Because that rewrite taught me something I wish I'd understood years earlier. Voice isn't a trick. It isn't a style. It's not something you sprinkle on top of a manuscript after you've written it. Voice is what happens when you stop standing between yourself and the story. And I know this sounds a little precious, but the truth is, the closer I got to this character, the closer I got to myself. And I've thought about that book a lot. At the time, it felt disappointing, and now I think it was necessary. It taught me exactly where my voice lived. And once I found it, I stopped looking for it anywhere else. And the very next novel was Tell Me What You Did. I didn't try to make it commercial. I didn't try to make it more literary. I didn't try to write the book I thought people wanted. I wrote the book that interested me the most. The book that scared me, the book that felt most like me, the book that had a ferocity that I think I'd been seeking since the previous one. And that became my breakout novel. So people sometimes ask me what changed with my 10th book. And the honest answer is, I don't think the biggest change happened on that book. I think it happened years earlier. The breakout simply made it visible. I've been thinking a lot about that Ramada ballroom lately, and it would have been really easy to dismiss that afternoon. Everybody has random thoughts. Everybody gets excited about something for a few days, and most of those things disappear. But this one didn't. And I think that's what made the difference. It kept coming back, even when I wasn't trying to think about it, even after the first manuscript, after all the rejections, even after the first published book. It just kept, asking for my attention. Have you ever had something like that? I mean, maybe it isn't writing, maybe it's painting, music, maybe it's opening a business or changing careers. Maybe it's moving somewhere you've always wanted to live. I have no idea what it is for you. All I know is that most of us are carrying around something we've been quietly kind of just negotiating with for years. We keep telling ourselves we'll get to it eventually. After work settles down, after the kids get older, after we have more money, more confidence. We become incredibly good at postponing the conversations we need to have with ourselves. Looking back, I think I got lucky. I listened before I understood. If I'd waited until I had confidence, I'm sure I'd still be waiting. If I'd waited until I believed I was qualified, hell, I never would have started. Instead, I just kept following something that, for lack of a better term, interested me. And I don't mean every day was magical, far from it. Some books worked, some didn't. Some days I wrote 1,000 words, and some days I deleted 2,000 words. There were plenty of moments when I questioned myself, and I still do. There still are those moments. Writing never solved that. I think what it did was give me a better question. Instead of asking, am I good enough? I started asking, am I paying attention? Paying attention to the story, to the character, to this thing that won't leave me alone. And that's really the job. Writing isn't forcing ideas into existence. It's noticing the ones that refuse to disappear. It's true for novels, and I think it's true for life. When I look back over the last 20 plus years, the books are obviously important to me. They've given me a career I never imagined. They've introduced me to readers all over the world, and they've brought extraordinary people into my life. And it's hard to describe how grateful I am for every bit of that. But if it all disappeared tomorrow, if every book went out of print and I never published another novel, I'd still be thankful that I listened to that little question in Ramada ballroom. Because that question led me somewhere I never expected. It led me to myself. And maybe that's what I've been trying to say all along. I don't think writing made me a different person. I think writing introduced me to the person I'd been all along. And the beauty is that process is still happening, and I hope it never stops. Every book teaches me something I didn't know about myself. Every novel still asks me to become a slightly different writer, or even a slightly different person. That's one of the reasons I love talking to writers. Whether you've published 10 books or you're staring at a blank page wondering if you should even begin, we're all dealing with that same uncertainty. We're all trying to figure out what deserves our attention. So if there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it has nothing to do with publishing or bestseller lists or rejection. I'd simply ask you this. What's the question that keeps coming back? What's the idea that refuses to leave you alone? What's the part of your life you've been meaning to explore even though you can't fully explain why? And what are you going to do about it? You don't need to know where it leads. I certainly didn't. You don't have to know whether you'll succeed. I didn't know that either. Chances were I wasn't going to succeed. You just have to be willing to follow it long enough to see what it's trying to show you. And that's all I did. I followed a question. And somewhere along the way, it answered one I didn't even know I was asking.